of this group and to present some of the research I have been doing over the last few years. Maybe I'll just share my screen of the presentation. Yes, so today's presentation will be about the intergenerational aspect of children work and education in the Palestinian context. And I'm focusing this presentation or drawing this presentation based on my PhD research, which I did between 2013 and 2018 in Switzerland at the University of Freiburg. And I will be just reflecting on some aspects of that research, focusing specifically on generation and intergenerational aspects of children work. And probably in the Q&A, we will, and also in the breakout rooms, we will have more time to discuss also the potential of exploring the intergenerational aspect of work and what it means for understanding childhood in general, and also children work and education in different settings. So I got interested in the question of children work when I was working with one of the UN agencies in Palestine. And I remember when I had some interviews with children who have been engaged in some of the smuggling activities. Some of those children were digging tunnels, basically between Egypt and the Gaza Strip. And they were, because of their size and because they are, because of their function in the labor market there, they were easier to be recruited for this kind of work. And I engaged in several conversations with those children. And this is where I got interested in the question of children work, attending to the political value of work, but also getting to know more about the dynamics that are happening between children and their parents and the different generations, childhood as one group, coherent group, and adults as well. So just to go through like a bit of background about the Gaza Strip in Palestine, probably this will help us understanding more about the research which I have been doing, and also the value or the potential of understanding the intergenerational aspect of work in Palestine. So the Gaza Strip is a small territory which is politically part of the occupied Palestinian territories. And it is a small territory around 365 square kilometers. It's inhabited by more than 2 million people. It's considered one of the most densely populated areas in the world, and half of the population are children. Actually, more than half of the population are children, and this has many implications on the question of child labor or children work, but also on many questions related to social policy, planning, governance of childhood in that territory. The majority of the population of Gaza are refugees. They have been displaced in 1948 from their hometowns after the establishment of the state of Israel. And this adds another variable or another level of vulnerability to the population who are living there. They are displaced, and which means that when they think about education, when they think about work, their thinking is situated with this kind of experience of displacement. The territory was occupied in 1967 by Israel, and it lasted under the control of Israel until 1993, when the peace process started between Israel and Palestine. And during this period, the first intifada, or a popular uprising, erupted in both of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip to demonstrate and to protest the living conditions which Palestinians were living in. I'm bringing all of these dynamics because these will be the different generations I will be looking at in discussing children work in Palestine. As I said before, the territory was handed over to the Palestinian Authority, which was established as part of the peace process agreement between Palestine and Israel. And it continued to operate under the governance of the Palestinian Authority since then, since 1994, with the establishment of the Palestinian Authority. Gaza Strip in particular has been under the Israeli blockade since 2007. and which is of course counted as one of like forms of collective punishment by ICRC and other international organizations. But this adds another level of vulnerability to the population, especially the question of unemployment and the question of poverty, which is dominant among the population in the Gaza Strip. We have more than 50% of the people who are unemployed in the Gaza Strip for many political and socio-economic reasons. We can probably speak more about these aspects in a bit. And the situation has been exacerbated since the start of the ongoing pandemic. It affected people like living conditions and the way they can have access to food and other kind of commodities. So we know now the location. We know that the population is more than 2 million people. Half of them are children. It's mostly densely, it's one of the most densely populated area. Around 5,000 person live by 1 square kilometer. Most of the population are refugees, unemployed, and food insecure, according to the WFP, World Food Program. And this resulted in a lot of like international development agencies stepping in, making the Palestinian territories is one of the biggest recipients of aid worldwide, even comparing with the areas which are affected by conflict, sometimes in comparing to Iraq and Afghanistan, or also when comparing with the neighboring countries, as we can see in this diagram. So as we can see here, for example, even if we compare it to Jordan, Lebanon, and Egypt, the ODA per capita is higher than all of the neighboring countries, and also comparing to Iraq and Afghanistan. And this is very important also because this is again one of the generation which this is an important context for one of the generations that I'm exploring as part of my research, especially knowing how much reliance on aid would affect values which are related to work and education in the Palestinian society in general, but also to the children who are part of that society. To move on and to give you a bit of idea, just a broad idea about child labor in Gaza, it is reported that we have around 3% of people who are in work in the Gaza Strip, and this is based on an old estimate, but numbers are always problematic. Probably Edward can tell us more about how problematic are numbers and estimates of child labor around the world, but also in Palestine. But just to give you an idea that in the West Bank and in Gaza, we have in total, we have around 3% of the children who are in work. But this kind of reporting is based on the parents' point of view. When comparing to the point of view of children reported that, the percentage or the estimate of children who are in work is higher when we rely on the reporting of the children themselves. And most of the children work in different sectors, including in agriculture and mechanic workshops, but the majority of them work in family enterprises as unpaid workers. And this is, of course, a very old estimate. It keeps changing, also mirroring the changing in the living conditions and the socioeconomic conditions that are dominant there. To give a bit of context about the legal kind of instruments or legal law, laws which are controlling child labor or children work in Palestine, there are two important legislations. The first one is the labor law number 7 in 2000, and the other one is the child law number 7 in 2004. What is important, without getting into the details in these legislations, what is important is that both of these legislations take a strict kind of measures against child labor, even in comparing with the ILO conventions. And for many, this is an expression of a political will from the Palestinian state or state of Palestine, to be part of an international dialogue, trying to kind of say that we are part of the international community. We put our standards in line with the international community without really thinking about how to enforce these kind of legislations. In fact, none of these legislation are enforced in reality for many reasons related to the sovereignty of the Palestinian state on the land. But it was kind of a political statement that we are endorsing all of these legislations. We are localizing and putting this legislation into action without really getting into looking critically at what these legislations mean. And of course, as everywhere in the world, we have a number of assumptions which are also held in the about child labor in the Palestinian context, including blaming poverty for being the only reason or the main reason for child labor, and the impact of child labor on children's health and education, and the fact that education and work cannot be combined together, in addition to the fact that children are usually forced to undertake this kind of work. And then we have the other aspect, which is usually kind of communicated by international organizations, and this is one of the arguments for for acting against all forms of children work, including the fact that child labor restrain countries' potential from to economic development. And these are just some of the assumptions which are usually we hear about as people who work continuously on the question of children work and education. In my research, I try to investigate some of these aspects, looking at to what extent poverty is a reason, looking at other motivation and reasons behind children work, but also exploring the relationship between work and education in the different contexts and across the different generations. So in my research, I try to answer some questions, including why do children work, and trying to look at how children and work are constructed in the Palestinian society across the different communities, trying to attend to the uniqueness of the of children work and education and their construction in the different communities across Gaza, but also looking at how these construction change over time, and to kind of support the idea that work and education are social constructs, and they are not like just one phenomena that we have to treat the same way or deal with the same way everywhere around the world. And another aspect that I look at as part of my research is the relationship between work and education. We know that, for example, international organizations and ILO in particular tend to look at these two areas as incompatible spheres. So, and this is one of the areas that I got interested in. And I look at children work and education in the context of political activism, state building, and foreign aid, three main variables which are important in the contemporary history of Palestine and which have many impact on the way we understand children work and education. And last is the intergenerational aspect of children work and education, which we'll be speaking more about during this presentation. So just to give a bit of background, a bit of theory, usually in sociology, we have different ways of looking at generation. These are the main usages of generation in anthropology, but also in sociology. And I use here a cursor kind of review of the different use of this of the concept of generation in sociology. And in particular, in my research, I focus on two of them. The first one is generation as a principle of kinship descent, and the second one, generation as historical period. And in each of these two ways or two usages of the concept of generation, I try to look at the relationship between parents and their kids, the relationship between adults and kids and children, and trying to explore what these kind of relations and negotiations and power dynamics would tell us about children work and education in these contexts. And the other use of the generation as a concept in my research was about looking at different political milestones across the contemporary history of Palestine, and see how, at what extent these political milestones and socioeconomic situation that dominate these periods brought about like a new construction of children and childhood across these three different generations. So in particular, I focus on three different generations. The first one is during the first Intifada, which is a popular uprising erupted in 1987, and in which children were a key part of the protests, of the demonstrations. They were taking actions against, for example, the Israeli soldiers. And as part of my research, I look at some of the archival research, but also doing interviews with people who lived that generation, trying to explore how children were represented in the media, how they were portrayed by different institutions, also how they are perceived by the caregivers or by the parents of those children. And I come across a group of a big number of posters which were distributed, printed and distributed at that period. And for example, I can show here three examples of these posters. And here we can see the celebration of children as heroes, as political activists, as people who are taking up the struggle for liberation and resistance of their country. Here we can see, for example, in the poster in the middle, we can see a mother handing a piece of stone to her kid, celebrating that resistant aspect, which is related to idealization of children and childhood as political activists at that generation. And of course, moving on, and with the establishment of the Palestinian Authority, and just in 5 years, a new kind of idealization and representation started to appear. In that period, children were celebrated as state builders, and their contribution in education, in music production, in reading, in engaging in creative arts was celebrated more than the political activism. The general mood during that phase was that we have to build our country. It's a peace process. So everyone should kind of, instead of engaging in political activism, we should instead invest in the education of everyone. And of course, this has many implications in the way labor and work was seen by the families and the children themselves. Going to schools, engaging in educational activities, engaging in art and music activities was seen as something that every child should do. And it was seen by the Palestinian institutions as one of the ways to overcome the instability which dominated a century before. So here we can see also another and a different portrayal of children and childhood in that political generation, if we would like to speak about it in terms of generations. Moving on, and only in 5 years after, we are moving to a different kind of generation, political generation, in which Palestinians become more dependent on foreign aid. The economic and political situation deteriorated dramatically, and we started to see a different portrayal and a representation of children, and children again become idealized as figures of resistance, but also were seen as in terms of being victims. And of course, the centrality of education was also affected, and of course of work has been affected by this representation and idealization of children throughout this period. So, I mean, looking at these three different generations, I come to see different ways children and childhood were constructed at three different levels. At one level, we can see that in the first Intifada, children were constructed as freedom fighters, as stone throwers, and later on they were seen as state builders. And later on, we started to see a different kind of portrayal as figures of resistance in the Palestinian society. But also at another level, we started to see how children were seen as heroes and sometimes as victims. Heroes for taking up the struggle for liberation, but victims for enduring this kind of socioeconomic situation which dominated these different historical periods. But also we started to see a distinction between a local childhood that is situated in these dynamics that are happening in the Palestinian society back then, comparing to something which is national and institutional childhood, which is different from how the globalized childhood as a period of play and leisure and education is usually advocated for. And as part of my research as well, I came to see how children mobilize this kind of idealization and representation in their favor. So I attend more to the agentic aspect of children, how children mobilize this idealization and representation in their negotiation, for example, for more space, for in their power dynamics with their parents and also with adults as a distinct category. I don't know how much time I have, Edward.
You don't have any more time, actually. So you try to wrap it up if you can.
Okay. Just I would like to move on just for one more aspect, which I think is very important for the question of generation, is the fact that I started to attend in my research also to the intergenerational aspect of children work. And the main idea of that was that I started to think about work as a form of negotiating the power dynamics that are organizing that hierarchical structure between children and adults. So one of the ways that I started to think about children work is the way that children use their work in order to have more say in their family decision-making processes that are happening at the micro level, but also at the macro level. So as we know, as in many societies, the Palestinian society is organized in a hierarchical way based on gender and age. And I use the theorization of Lena Alanin in terms of generation and intergenerational aspects to look at generation as one of the organizers of the relationship between adults and children, the same way gender and class can be seen as social organizers of the class and other social categories, for example, women and men. And I started to look at the dynamics within the children as a distinct group from adults, and to look at the interactions that are happening between children and adults, and to what extent work has been always used, at least in the Palestinian society, as a way to situate the children in differently in that kind of hierarchy, and which will give them more space to, for example, to decide about their own lives, to have a say in family decision-making processes, but also to be seen and to be respected and to be listened to within their societies. So, I mean, these are some of the aspects that I come across in my research. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time to reflect on all of this, but probably I'll elaborate more on these aspects in the Q&A question. Sorry for taking too long. Thanks, Edward.
Thank you, Mohammed. I will stop the recording now, as you can stop your screen. Thank you.